The afternoon at the Riverside Medical Clinic was deceptively quiet. The air smelled of lemon polish and old magazines, and no one expected a miracle. Elena Carter, a quiet nurse filling in at the check-in desk, was busy logging routine appointments. She was just a face behind a glass partition, until the heavy front doors swung open. A wounded man stumbled in, pale, gasping, and clutching a blood-stained jacket. As the staff scrambled to move him, he gripped Elena's wrist and whispered 5 words that stopped time. "Angel 9 is real." Suddenly, the room went silent. A legend was revealed. History made. Truth revealed. Elena Carter was 31 years old, and in the rigid, loud hierarchy of the medical world, she was currently a ghost. She was a senior trauma nurse with a decade of high-pressure experience, a woman whose hands had restarted hearts in the mud, and whose mind could calculate complex medication dosages faster than a computer in a crisis. But today, she was simply covering the desk. A temporary staffing shortage had pulled her away from the clinical floor to handle the mundane tasks of the check-in area, checking IDs, verifying insurance, and pointing patients toward the restrooms. To the doctors who breezed past her with their coffee cups and the patients who complained about the wait times, Elena was just a receptionist in scrubs, a background character in a world that only valued those holding the scalpels. The atmosphere at Riverside was a sharp, sterile contrast to the adrenaline-soaked trauma bays Elena usually occupied. It was a suburban facility, a place of routine physicals, minor ailments, and the slow ticking of a wall clock that seemed to mock the urgency of her past life. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency buzz that most people ignored, but to Elena, it was the rhythm of a system that had become too comfortable in its own silence. She moved through her paperwork with a grace that suggested she was measuring the atmospheric pressure of the room rather than just filing charts. She didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't care about the lack of a formal salute. She only cared about the accuracy of the baseline. She was a creature of the deep focus, a state where her brain processed information in high definition, while the world around her saw only a blurred background. Earlier that morning, a junior administrator named Sarah, whose uniform was as stiff as her attitude, had given Elena a slightly condescending orientation. "Just keep the queue moving, Elena," Sarah had said, barely looking up from her glowing smartphone. "Try not to get bogged down in the details. It's just intake. We don't need any emergency room intensity here. Just smile and take the names." Sarah saw a worker who followed orders. She didn't see a master of the threshold who had survived environments where the air itself was a weapon. She didn't realize that Elena was currently running a mental system audit of the building's emergency exits and the location of the nearest oxygen regulators. Elena didn't defend her background. She didn't mention the elite search and rescue units she had managed in the red sector, or the hundreds of lives she had stabilized in the back of moving helicopters under heavy fire. She didn't mention the scars on her knuckles from years of rhythmic CPR or the depth of the medical library she carried in her mind. She simply gave a polite, practiced nod. "I understand, Sarah. I'll ensure the files are organized." Her voice was as smooth as silk over tempered steel, calm, professional, and entirely devoid of ego. She spent the next 3 hours watching the world through the glass partition, noticing the tiny details no one else saw. To the world, she was a secretary. To the truth, she was the anchor of the baseline. She noticed the slight rhythmic tremor in an elderly man's hand as he signed his name, a sign of early Parkinson's, or perhaps just a dangerous drop in blood sugar. She noticed the specific shallow rhythm of a young mother's breathing as she waited in the corner, a whisper of a brewing anxiety attack that the triage nurses would likely miss because they were looking at their tablets instead of the person. Elena was a creature of total awareness, trained to detect the smallest anomalies in her environment before they turned into catastrophes. But in the eyes of the staff, she was just the girl at the front. In the grand, loud hierarchy of the city, she was just another anonymous medical worker heading home to a cold dinner and a few precious hours of sleep. Elena lived in that silence, waiting for the shift to end. She was counting the minutes until she could return to her actual job, far away from the petty complaints and the sterile indifference of the lobby. She thought about the godlike surgeons she had worked with, men and women whose names were on the wings of hospitals, and she realized that out here, in the quiet suburbs, none of that mattered. But she also knew that the machine never stops. It only changes pace. The afternoon sun painted the lobby floor in long, amber stripes, creating a sense of peace that was almost hypnotic. But Elena knew that peace was a fragile thing, and she knew that in medicine, the loudest problems often start with the quietest signals. She clutched her pen, her mind already running through a high-speed simulation of a multi-system failure, just to keep her skills sharp. She was the anchor the clinic didn't know it had, waiting for the moment when the rhythm of the afternoon would finally shatter. She was the code whisperer, and her shift was about to become legendary. If you think some roles are underestimated just because they look simple, comment, "That's so unfair." The rhythm of the afternoon shattered at exactly 2:45 p.m. The heavy reinforced glass doors of the clinic swung open with a violent thud that echoed through the quiet lobby like a gunshot. A man stumbled into the room, his movements jagged, uncoordinated, and desperate. He wasn't screaming. He was vibrating with a frequency of pure, unfiltered shock. He wore a torn tactical vest, stained with the dust of a training range, and his skin was a mottled, ashy gray, a shade Elena recognized instantly as the final transition of a body running out of compensatory time. The air in the lobby suddenly felt heavy, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the gravity of the crisis. The reaction from the staff was a wave of instantaneous, unmanaged confusion. Two triage nurses scrambled toward him, their faces pale with a lack of preparation for this kind of raw trauma. They were used to paper cuts and flu symptoms, not the visceral reality of a failing system. "Sir, you need to go to the emergency room. We aren't equipped for this here," one of the nurses shouted, her voice tight with a panic that was starting to infect the waiting room. They were throwing hammers at a problem that required a needle. They were staring at the noise while the signal was screaming for help. They began to guide him toward a plastic chair, intent on calling an ambulance and transferring the problem out of their sterile environment. They were following the clinic manual, looking for a protocol to shift the responsibility, but Elena was already moving. She didn't wait for Sarah's permission. She didn't ask for a supervisor's blessing. She stepped out from behind the glass partition with a speed and intent that made the residents stop and breathe. She saw what the others missed. The man wasn't just injured, he was experiencing an atmospheric lock. He was drowning on dry land. As the triage nurses tried to move him, the man's hand suddenly shot out, grabbing Elena's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for someone in his condition. His eyes rolled back for a fraction of a second, finding hers with a terrifying clarity that cut through the clinical layer of her mind. It was the gaze of a man who had seen the abyss and was looking for a bridge. "Angel 9, he whispered, the sound barely a breath in the vacuum of the room. "Angel 9 is real." The room went deathly silent. The triage nurses paused, looking at Elena with utter confusion. "What did he say? Is he delusional?" one of them asked, looking for a logical explanation for the ramblings of a dying man. But to Elena, it was a thunderclap in a silent room. Angel 9 wasn't a nickname. It was a high-level classified call sign for a search and rescue medical operative who operated in the black zones. Zones where the rules of civilian medicine were rewritten in blood and pressure. It was the call for a master. Elena stopped. She felt the familiar electric itch of the shadow protocol returning to her fingers. She didn't see the check-in forms anymore. She saw the anatomy of a crisis. She looked at the man's neck, not at his obvious wounds, and saw the 3-millimeter lag in the rise of his left carotid pulse. She saw the specific bruised pattern behind his ear, a battle sign of an internal pressure trauma from a simulated blast drill. This wasn't a suburban clinic patient. This was a Tier 1 asset who had crawled miles to find the only person he believed could save him in the dark. He had found his guardian. "Stop moving him," Elena commanded. Her voice wasn't a shout, but it had a density that felt like a physical wall. The sheer authority in her tone, a frequency born of 1,000 trauma codes in the desert and the mountains, made the triage nurses actually flinch and step back. She had just taken the lead without saying a word about her rank. The medical fog of war began to settle over the lobby. The staff was still trying to follow clinic policy, looking for a form to fill out or a doctor to sign off on a transfer. Elena realized that if she followed the clinic's rhythm, the man would be a statistic before the ambulance even hit the highway. The system was clogging at the throat, and she was the only one who knew how to clear the airway. She realized that in trauma, speed without awareness is just a faster way to fail. She knelt beside the man, her knees hitting the polished floor with a dull thud. She didn't care about her sweater or the receptionist badge pinned to her chest. She was back in the zone, a mental space where the world narrowed down to the pulse, the pressure, and the procedure. "I've got you, soldier," Elena whispered, her voice a low, rhythmic drone designed to lower his sympathetic nervous system's fight-or-flight response. "I am Angel 9. The perimeter is secure. The AO is cold. Do you copy?" The man's eyes flickered, his breathing starting to synchronize with her steady, heavy rhythm. "Copy, Angel 9, he gasped, his body finally surrendering to the safety of her competence. The anchor was set. The bystanders in the lobby watched in absolute silence, mesmerized by the interaction. They didn't see a receptionist anymore. They saw a conductor, a master who was reading a map they couldn't even see. Elena realized that small signals often carry the biggest meaning, and she was the only one in the room with a compass. Truth was finally demanding a voice. The machine was about to be reset. If you realize small signals can carry big meaning, comment, "I was wrong." The 240 seconds that followed were a masterclass in high-demand clinical precision and biological control. Elena Carter didn't perform a miracle in her own mind. She simply performed a sequence of actions in the correct order, with a technical perfection that made the frantic energy of the clinic staff look like static on an old television. The room seemed to grow colder, sharper, as if the master had brought her own climate of absolute calm. 1. Stopping the routine flow and geometric mastery. "Sarah, call a level 1 trauma activation at Metropolitan and tell them we have a shadow descent injury. Do not call for a standard transport. Tell them the Raven is on the line and we are code red," Elena barked. Sarah, the administrator who had earlier told Elena to just smile, stood frozen, her phone slipping in her sweating palm. Elena didn't wait. She pointed to a junior nurse. "You, get me the advanced surgical kit from the locked cabinet. Use my override code, Alpha 9 Echo, move, now." The sheer command in her voice bypassed every clinic hierarchy. People were no longer questioning her. They were mirroring her urgency. She was the conductor of a dying orchestra. 2. The rapid field assessment. Elena didn't waste time with a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. She used her senses. She felt the space between the ribs with a mechanical, cold precision. "He's not in shock from the blood loss," she announced to the room, her voice acting as a psychological stabilizer. "It's a diaphragmatic tension lock. The blast pressure from his training exercise is mirroring his current environment. His heart won't have room to beat in 60 seconds if we don't vent the thoracic cavity. He's drowning on dry land." She was reading the anatomy of the crisis before the monitors could even sync. 3. The surgical intervention of the master. She reached for a large-bore 14-gauge needle from the kit the nurse had just brought. She didn't wait for a sterile drape. She didn't wait for a local anesthetic, and she certainly didn't wait for a doctor's signature. She felt the second intercostal space with a practiced thumb. "Stay with me, soldier." Deep breath on 3. 1, 2, 3. She drove the needle in with a sharp, practiced thrust. A sharp, audible hiss of trapped air, like a tire blowing out, whistled out of the man's chest. It was the sound of a life returning. On the portable monitor they had just hooked up, the oxygen saturation began a steady, healthy climb. 82, 88, 94. The flat, erratic line of his heart rate began to spike into healthy, rhythmic peaks. 10, 20, 60, 80. It was the sound of a soul being anchored back to the earth. The room seemed to exhale in unison with the patient. 4. Clear communication and team synchronization. The lead physician of the clinic, Dr. Sterling, burst into the lobby, his face a mask of professional irritation and ego. "What is going on out here? Who authorized an invasive procedure in the lobby? This is a violation of—" Elena didn't even turn her head. She was already taping the needle in place and checking the man's pupils with a tiny penlight. "The patient has a grade 4 atmospheric thoracic leak, doctor. He was 40 seconds from a refractory loop. I vented the pressure and stabilized the airway. He needs high-flow O2 and a vascular clamp on the secondary bleed. Miller, titrate the O2 to 5 liters. Now." Sterling stopped dead in his tracks. He heard the terminology. He saw the technique, a specialized shadow stabilization that was only taught to elite military medical operatives in the black zones. He looked at the woman he had ignored for 3 months and realized he wasn't looking at a receptionist. He was looking at the woman who wrote the field manual he had studied in his residency. He was looking at Angel 9. The legend was standing in his lobby. "Angel 9, Sterling whispered. His voice hushed with a new kind of awe that silenced the remaining noise in the room. Elena finally looked up, her expression as neutral as a stone wall. "The count is correct, doctor. The patient is stable for transport. If you want to help me hold the seal while we transition him to the gurney. We have 2 minutes before the secondary pressure builds." She had dismantled the clinic's ego-driven hierarchy in under 4 minutes. Not by shouting louder, but by being the only person who knew the rhythm of the storm. Truth had arrived with surgical precision. In those few minutes, the clinic lobby had been transformed into a Tier 1 trauma bay. The screaming had stopped. The panic had been replaced by a focused, rhythmic hum. The man, Elias, was no longer gray. His color was returning to a healthy bronze. His vitals were holding at a stable baseline. Elena stood by the bed, her hands steady, her posture as straight as a spear. Truth had been served. If you believe real understanding comes from experience, comment, "I am indebted." The handover was remarkably quiet, a sharp contrast to the explosion of noise that had started the shift. The specialized ambulance arrived with a roar of diesel and a flash of blinding, rhythmic red and blue lights that danced off the clinic's glass walls. The paramedics jumped out before the vehicle had even fully stopped, their gear clattering as they ran toward the center of the lobby. They were expecting a chaotic scene of panicking civilians and a messy sight. But what they found was a perfectly managed clinical environment that looked like an extension of their own hospital. One of the paramedics, a veteran of 15 years on the road, looked at the needle decompression and the way the airway had been stabilized with a specialized 3-point seal. He saw the specific Raven seal on the tape, a mark only used by the shadow divisions. He stopped and looked at Elena, his eyes widening. "Who made the call?" he asked, his voice full of a raw, genuine respect. He saw the mark of a master. A junior nurse pointed a shaking finger toward the check-in desk. "She did, Elena. She just stepped out and took over." The paramedic nodded once, a sharp, formal movement of recognition. "I thought so. I haven't seen a first response that clean since the extraction in the North Sector 10 years ago. Good to see you're still in the game, Angel 9. The staff in the area went stone silent, their eyes turning toward Elena like she was a ghost that had finally become solid. The "just a nurse" label had been stripped away, revealing the tempered steel beneath. Sarah, the administrator, walked over to Elena. Her earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a profound, trembling humility. "Elena, I had no idea. Why didn't you say anything? Why were you just sitting at the desk taking insurance cards while a man like that was looking for you?" Elena looked at the woman with a deep, cold, and intelligent gaze. "Because someone needs to be on duty, Sarah. And I don't need a title to do this job. I'm looking for a benchmark, and you're looking for a role. You'll understand that the most dangerous person in the room is usually the one who says the least and sees the most." She didn't let you make a mistake, Sarah. She let the situation escalate to the point where you were finally willing to listen. When the man was wheeled out of the clinic, the atmosphere changed forever. The staff no longer called her receptionist. They didn't even call her Elena. They gave her a silent, respectful space, as if she were a four-star general returning from a successful campaign. They realized that identity didn't need to be revealed to be real. It only needed to be proven when the world began to tilt toward tragedy. The invisible gatekeeper had straightened the world. Elena didn't stay to listen to the praise or wait for the television cameras to start rolling in. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She picked up her pen, rearranged the stack of insurance papers, and walked back behind the glass wall. She was still just a nurse. She was still just receiving patients. But inside the walls of Riverside, the truth was finally revealed. She was the operator of the emergency system, and she had just saved a life without lifting a finger for her own glory. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the lobby in shades of bruised purple and gold, Elena finished her logs. She was just a ghost again. But a ghost that everyone now knew carried the weight of the mountain on her shoulders. She merged back into the flow of the evening, her mission complete. If you believe identity doesn't need to be announced to be real, comment, "I will live a decent life." The story of Elena Carter reminds us that true greatness is often found in the people we choose not to notice. We live in a world that is currently obsessed with stars. The ones who take up the most space, the ones who shout the loudest into microphones, and the ones who crave the bright spotlight for their own ego and validation. We assume that to be powerful, we must have a prestigious title, a loud voice, or a formal uniform that commands respect. We judge people by their eyes, not their resumes. But the real anchors of our society, the people who actually hold the fabric of our world together when the storms hit, are the ones who stay ready in the shadows. They are the ones who master their craft in the deep silence of the night shifts, the trauma bays, and the quiet corners of the world. They understand that real impact is a service, not a status symbol. They are the ones who understand that a title on a door doesn't save a life, but a hand on a pulse does. They are the lighthouses that don't need a microphone to guide a ship through the rocks. Elena didn't do something extraordinary in her own mind. She simply did what she was trained to do with absolute surgical precision. But in an environment of total chaos and limited resources, doing the right thing is the most extraordinary act a human can perform. She proved that you don't need a uniform or a badge to lead. You only need the clarity to see the truth and the courage to meet it without ego. She showed that the most powerful thing in a room is a mind that is clear of noise. Her silence was her strength. We often overlook the quiet professionals in our own lives, the nurses, the teachers, the caregivers, the support staff, forgetting that they are the ones holding the line when everything else starts to tear at the seams. We mistake their silence for a lack of knowledge, when in fact it is the highest form of concentration. Elena Carter wasn't a hero because she was better than Sarah. She was a hero because she was prepared. She was willing to trust her eyes when the high-tech machines were telling everyone else a different story. She was the truth in a room full of noise. The next time you find yourself in a room where the experts are failing and the noise is deafening, look for the person in the corner who has been watching the baseline. Look for the quiet observer who has seen the patterns that others deem too small to notice. They might just be the angel nine you need to get home alive. They might just be the only reason the whole world keeps spinning while you are asleep in your bed. True strength lies in stillness. True leadership lies in transparency. And true heroes don't care if you know their names. They only care about getting the job done and everyone sleeping soundly. Be master of the details. Be the silence that understands the rhythm of the world. Be the truth. Let your actions be the only statement you need to make. Be a lighthouse. Because ultimately, it's not what people say about you that defines your legacy, but what the world becomes because of your presence. Even if you live in the shadows until called upon to reveal your true self. That is the power of the silent professional. And that is the lasting lesson of Angel 9. Truth had been served with surgical precision, a story written in silence and saved in a heartbeat. True mastery never needs a stage. It just needs a moment, and Elena Carter had found hers. History had been written in the hiss of a needle and the stillness of a gaze. If you believe the people who quietly carry real experience and step up when it matters, deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that sometimes the most important person is the one no one notices, don't forget to subscribe for more.